Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tearing down what is essentially an invisible wall in global intelligence. We're going to deconstruct the fascinating history of how human knowledge got partitioned into two distinct buckets, traditional and modern. And spoiler alert, we're going to see how global politics completely rewired the way we even view science. So let's just dive right into it. Let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental question. What actually makes knowledge modern? I want you to really challenge your baseline assumptions here for a second. Is it about when a scientific breakthrough was discovered, or is it mostly about who discovered it? To get to the bottom of this, we have to look at the popular definition of traditional knowledge. Usually, it's viewed as this old, unscientific dogma, stuff that supposedly hinders progress and just breeds superstition. It's almost always positioned as the direct opposite of modern Western science. But today, we're going to neutrally examine the source material to unpack exactly how this very specific definition was historically manufactured. And that brings us to a really fascinating concept the sources call the Greek irony. Think about the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed. They were massively triggered by the revival of ancient Greek philosophy, right? And that was knowledge preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars for over a millennium. Yet nobody goes around calling Aristotle's work traditional. When ancient Western knowledge was revived, it was celebrated as the absolute bedrock of science. The historical records actually offer a pretty stark reality check here. Picture the 1750s. Early European explorers are traveling to India, and they find a huge contrast to their own rudimentary rural tech back home. India possessed these highly advanced, specialized systems in everything from mathematics and astronomy to metallurgy and mortar techniques. And those early European visitors, they weren't looking down on this knowledge at all. In fact, they were actively trying to learn from it and export it. Take Major Arthur Cotton, for example, a legendary British engineer. When the massive Kaveri River irrigation systems in South India were failing under early British control, the standard European methods were totally useless. So what did Cotton do? He boldly adopted indigenous Indian engineering techniques. He actually noted in his own records that learning their specific method for securing foundations in loose sand literally saved the projects. It turned a failing infrastructure into a complete financial success. And this reliance wasn't just for engineering, it extended right into medicine. The East India Company was facing deadly smallpox outbreaks among their rapidly expanding troops, and they had zero European cures. So in the year 1800, the Madras government legally mandated the traditional Indian practice of variolation for its army. Think about that. Colonial rulers relied heavily on this so-called traditional medicine to survive epidemics, long before Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine ever reached their shores. So, this creates a really wild historical paradox. If early Europeans deeply respected and literally relied on Indian knowledge to survive and thrive, why did the global narrative suddenly flip? How did Indian science become universally labeled as backward and traditional? Well, the source material points to a profound political crisis following the 1857 revolt, right around the peak of the European Industrial Revolution. Basically, to justify ruling over a distant, highly civilized nation, colonial powers needed a new story. Historical records suggest that the dividing line between modern and traditional was artificially drawn to depict the West as this benevolent, scientifically supreme force, stepping in to civilize a supposedly backward nation. You can see this shift starkly captured in an 1835 policy minute by Lord Macaulay, which heavily shaped colonial education. Listen to this. He claimed Indian medical doctrines would disgrace an English farrier, that's a horse doctor, and its astronomy would make boarding school girls laugh. According to historians, this was definitely not a peer-reviewed scientific assessment. It was a deliberate political strategy designed to establish Western cultural dominance. But here's the catch. The actual scientists of the era completely disagreed with the politicians. When the British government sent their top agricultural chemists out in 1889 and 1905 to evaluate Indian agriculture, both scientists reported back that the indigenous farming systems were highly advanced, superior, and worthy of immense respect. And the imperial government's response? They completely shelved the reports. Acknowledging Indian scientific superiority was just too much of a political liability. And the economic fallout from these policies was just staggering. If you look at the GDP comparisons, in 1700 and 1820, India's economy absolutely dwarfed both the UK and the US. I mean, it wasn't even close. But by 1950, at the end of colonial rule, the US and UK economies had skyrocketed, while India's growth had severely stagnated. It really highlights that the traditional label wasn't just about cultural perception, it actively dictated who got to participate in global economic progress. This massive economic shift was heavily enforced by what researchers call the patent trap. During the Industrial Revolution, newly independent nations like the US passed laws that allowed them to freely copy European inventions. They essentially used open access to global ideas to build their massive wealth. But colonial India? They were legally locked out of this global exchange, completely unable to borrow or build upon modern innovations. Section 1. The Indian Synthesis: Reclaiming and Modernizing Heritage. But people didn't just accept this. In response, Indian intellectuals started building world-class scientific institutions entirely on their own terms. As early as 1817, the Hindu College in Calcutta was integrating vernacular languages with modern chemistry and math. By 1876, you have the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, which eventually produced Nobel laureates. And in 1909, the Tata family stepped up to found the renowned Indian Institute of Science. Pioneers across all sorts of fields began bridging the gap between their ancient heritage and modern frameworks. Hakim Ajmal Khan fought huge legal battles just to formalize and modernize Ayurveda and Unani medicine. R.N. Chopra pioneered the systematic pharmacology of indigenous drugs. And it wasn't just science. Superstar Gahar Jan brilliantly managed to compress vast, complex classical Indian music into strict 3-minute gramophone records. Meanwhile, T.K. Gaijar was training traditional local artisans in modern mechanical and electrical engineering. Consider this incredible breakthrough. Dr. Salimo Zaman Siddique actually used modern chemistry to directly validate ancient wisdom. He thoroughly analyzed the traditional neem plant, which indigenous practitioners had used for centuries, and successfully isolated 50 distinct chemical compounds from it. It proved absolutely beyond a doubt that these so-called traditional practices were rooted in hard empirical science. At the same time, visionaries were linking this synthesized science directly to rural survival. Rabindranath Tagore's Srinaketan experiment organically connected modern resources with local artisan cooperatives. The YMCA introduced modern apiaries and technology directly to farmers, and Mahatma Gandhi advocated for a craft-centric education system, arguing that purely Western-style schools were stripping village youth of the highly valuable existing skill pools right within their own families. Post-independence, this grassroots focus exploded into something called the People's Science Movement. Imagine a vast network of young, modern-educated scientists purposefully returning to the villages. They realized that the overwhelming majority of India was still being completely sustained by traditional knowledge. So they set out to scientifically document, validate, and support the rural craftsmen and farmers who were actually keeping the country alive. And the global impact of this synthesis is still totally staggering today. A landmark study by researchers Farnsworth and Suejarto looked at prescriptions dispensed right here in the United States. They found that over a quarter, 25.36% to be exact, rely on active principles derived directly from higher plants. Modern Western medicine is deeply intrinsically dependent on global traditional plant knowledge to even function. Eventually, the international community had to officially recognize this reality. Fast forward to the 1992 Earth Summit, where the UN Convention on Biological Diversity legally mandated that nations respect, preserve, and maintain the knowledge of indigenous and local communities. Traditional knowledge was finally acknowledged, not as some unscientific hindrance, but as a vital, highly sophisticated component required for human survival and global biodiversity. So, we've seen how the whole divide between modern and traditional was politically manufactured, and how bridging that gap can spark incredible, world-changing innovation. I want to leave you with this thought. As we face unprecedented global crises today, what other traditional knowledge is out there, just waiting to be rediscovered? Thank you for joining us. Have you ever wondered how a modern, multinational corporation can suddenly just claim legal ownership over an ancient, indigenous remedy? I mean, a remedy that's been used by local communities for literally thousands of years. It sounds completely impossible, right? Well, for a long time, this was actually happening all over the globe, and it triggered a massive international conflict over who truly owns the wisdom of our ancestors. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into how global treaties, developing nations, and some incredibly innovative legal shields are stepping up to protect traditional knowledge from commercial exploitation. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Valuing ancient wisdom. 2. The global rulebook. 3. The threat of biopiracy. 4. Positive and defensive shields. And 5. India's digital vault. To do all of this, we're grounding today's explainer in a really fantastic academic source, Nirmal Sengupta's Traditional Knowledge in Modern India. It's a great text because it brilliantly breaks down the super complex intersection between ancient, traditional knowledge and modern global policy.
Section 1. Valuing Ancient Wisdom.
So, what are we actually talking about when we say traditional knowledge, or TK? Well, we aren't just talking about one single thing. It's more like a vast interconnected web. We're talking about the medicinal use of plants, for sure, but it's also oral traditions, mythology, ancient architecture, handicrafts, and even the distinctive symbols and social contexts where all this wisdom was born. It's essentially the very cultural fabric of indigenous and local communities. For a long time, modern institutions kind of just ignored or even looked down on this knowledge. But gradually, things started to shift. In 1954, UNESCO adopted the Hague Convention to protect cultural property during armed conflicts. By 1978, the World Health Organization officially recognized the crucial role of traditional medicine with the Alma-Ata Declaration. Then, the International Labor Organization stepped up in 1989 to respect the customary laws of indigenous peoples, and by the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, treaties placed traditional knowledge squarely at the center of global survival and sustainability. The world was finally waking up.
Section 2. The Global Rulebook.
Okay, to navigate global traditional knowledge, you basically have to decode a United Nations alphabet soup. You've got the WHO actively mainstreaming traditional medicine into national healthcare systems. You have WIPO, which is right at the center of all this, trying to write international rules to protect that knowledge and govern benefit sharing. Then there's the WTO regulating global trade and the TRIPS agreement, which dictates global patent rules. And finally, UNEP links this ancient knowledge directly to environmental sustainability. Each one plays a really distinct, vital role in crafting the rules of the game. But even before a lot of those modern treaties existed, early leaders saw the potential for exploitation. Back at the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi forcefully presented the developing world's concerns. She said, "It would be ironic if the fight against pollution were to be converted into another business, out of which a few companies would make profits at the costs of the many." That statement laid the fundamental groundwork for fairness and benefit sharing in global environmental agendas for decades to come.
Section 3. The Threat of Biopiracy.
Let's actually break down the mechanics of what critics call biopiracy, using the infamous case of the W.R. Grace Company and the neem tree. Step 1. An American company notices that neem seeds have been used as a pesticide in India for thousands of years. Step 2. Because the active chemical is natural and can't be patented on its own, they just create a minor technique to extract it. Step 3. The U.S. Patent Office actually grants them a patent for this extraction method, largely because, at the time, U.S. laws sometimes ignored old foreign knowledge if it wasn't recorded in a very specific way. And step 4, suddenly, an Indian company would have to pay royalties to an American firm just to use a pesticide based on their own country's ancient wisdom. I mean, wild, right? And the neem tree definitely wasn't an isolated incident. In 1995, 2 researchers were granted a U.S. patent for turmeric to be used for healing wounds, which is a property that's been well known in India for centuries. Over in South Africa, the hoodia cactus, which has long been utilized by the San people of the Kalahari Desert to stave off hunger, was similarly targeted for weight loss patents. These aren't just abstract legal battles happening on paper. They are direct attempts to commodify the cultural heritage of indigenous populations. So naturally, the developing world pushed back. A whistleblower organization named RAFI coined this brilliant term, reverse piracy. During the 80s and 90s, Western companies were fiercely complaining about losing royalties to media and software piracy in the Global South. RAFI pointed out the profound irony here. The Global North was routinely extracting biological resources and traditional medicines from the South without paying a dime in compensation. You could easily argue the South was actually losing far more to this reverse piracy. Section 4. Positive and defensive shields. According to our source, there are 2 main strategies used to protect intellectual property in this space. First, you have positive protections. These are active legal rights that allow communities to manage, monetize, and control their own knowledge. On the flip side, you have defensive protections. These are strategies entirely designed to block others, like foreign pharmaceutical companies, from acquiring patents over traditional knowledge that already exists. Since standard patent laws just weren't built for ancient community-owned knowledge, countries had to literally invent new kinds of laws called sui generis laws. That's Latin for one of a kind. India, for instance, enacted the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act.
This is a super unique law that formally protects farmers' rights. It legally allows Indian farmers to save, use, exchange, and sell traditional seeds that their ancestors spent centuries cultivating. It even rewards farmers out of a national gene fund for conserving crop diversity. Section 5. India's Digital Knowledge Vault. 34 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. India realized that fighting these bad patents one by one was taking years per case and costing tens of thousands of dollars. So they decided to strike preemptively. 200 researchers spent 8 years taking 150 ancient books on traditional medicine, and they translated an astonishing 34 million pages of information into 5 international languages. They called it the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, or TKDL. So how does this digital vault actually work as a shield? Well, the database isn't open to the general public. Instead, India signed agreements with the biggest patent offices in the world. Now, when a company submits a patent application for some supposedly new medicinal extract, the international patent examiners use the TKDL to proactively cross-reference the application against centuries of codified Indian medicine. They can instantly see if the knowledge already exists. And it totally worked. Our source notes that by August 2014, the TKDL team had identified over 1,000 biopiracy attempts. They filed 1,120 prior art evidences. That's essentially documented proof that the knowledge wasn't new, submitted right at the pre-grant stage. This direct intervention led to hundreds of patent applications being withdrawn, canceled, or forced to amend their claims. They were shutting down the misappropriation before a patent was ever even granted. But here is the really cool part. This effort didn't just win individual legal cases, it literally forced a rewrite of the entire global patent system. Previously, the International Classification System only had one single subgroup for medicinal plants. Patent examiners were completely ill-equipped to judge traditional medicine. But because of India's TKDL classification system, a 5-nation task force expanded the medicinal plant categories from just 1 all the way to 207. Talk about systemic reform. And it's not all just about fighting off foreign corporations. It's also about building up the creators at home. Organizations in India, like the Honeybee Network and the National Innovation Foundation, are doing the groundwork. They physically scout rural communities for grassroots innovations and traditional knowledge. Then, they provide free legal assistance to actually file patents and trademarks on behalf of these local innovators. It ensures that the people who hold the knowledge personally benefit from their own brilliance. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. We live in an era of insanely rapid scientific advancement and globalization. But as technology accelerates to map genomes and synthesize compounds, who truly owns the knowledge of our ancestors? Do the corporations who find a modern way to extract it deserve the rights? Or does that intellectual property belong to the indigenous communities who preserved that wisdom for millennia? It is a massive question of equity, cultural preservation, and the future of global law. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore the fascinating depths of traditional knowledge.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating paradigm shift. We're going to look at how ancient indigenous systems, things that are so often brushed aside as relics of the past, actually hold these complex, highly scientific keys to solving our modern development crises. We rely so heavily on new technologies, right? But what if the absolute best, most robust blueprints for survival have literally been hiding in plain sight this entire time?
To really understand why this matters, we actually need to look back to 1976. That's when the International Labor Organization proposed this massive pivot in global development called the Basic Needs Strategy. They basically realized that defining progress purely through raw economic growth and industrialization just wasn't cutting it. Instead, they argued that priority absolutely had to be given to meeting minimum human needs, stuff like food, safe drinking water, shelter, and health.
But, well, here is the catch. To meet these basic human needs, modern policy almost entirely ignores a massive, vital resource: traditional knowledge. We're talking about indigenous skills and practices developed over thousands of years of trial, error, and meticulous scientific refinement. These are incredible time-tested methods for preserving food, healing bone fractures, managing soil, and safely birthing babies.
So today, we're exploring 4 pillars of survival based on this knowledge. We'll quickly cover rethinking traditional knowledge, midwives and health, ancient irrigation, vernacular housing, and finally, indigenous rights.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, rethinking traditional knowledge and shifting our paradigm.
As detailed in researcher N. Sengupta's extensive work, modern institutions have historically just dismissed indigenous practices as completely primitive. We often assume that because something is old, it somehow lacks scientific rigor. But that assumption completely fails to recognize the highly sophisticated engineering, the complex social structures, and the really profound ecological understanding embedded in these traditions.
Which brings us to Section 2. Let's look at our first core pillar, healthcare, by examining traditional midwives or the dye system.
There is a really stark historical contrast here that we need to talk about. Back in the 19th century, colonial initiatives like the 1885 Dufferin Fund deliberately demonized these traditional midwives. They painted this awful stereotype of dyes as dirty, uneducated, and dangerous. But historical reality tells a completely different story. These women were highly skilled practitioners, and their knowledge didn't just appear out of thin air. It was deeply rooted in incredibly complex ancient medical texts like the Charaka and Sushruta, which actually treated midwifery as a highly prestigious occupation. Fast forward to recent years, and by 2015, India saw its maternal mortality ratio drop drastically to 174 per 100,000 live births. Now that is a massive success, and it's largely credited to modern institutional programs like the National Rural Health Mission. Basically, they pushed for hospital deliveries and essentially replaced those traditional dyes with modern community health workers. But here is where it gets super interesting. We have this paradox. If institutional births are the absolute gold standard for safety, how do we explain the numbers? States with extremely high rates of institutional births, like Tamil Nadu, actually have a slightly higher neonatal mortality rate than states like Nagaland and Manipur, which still rely heavily on home births and traditional attendance. It turns out simply moving a birth into a hospital building doesn't automatically equal better health outcomes. Let's actually zoom out and look globally for a second. Over in the Netherlands, which is a highly developed country, 1/3 of women actively choose home births. Their culture views birth as a natural, warm family event, not some sterile medical crisis waiting to happen. It really makes you wonder, in our rush to modernize, was excluding the deeply experienced Indian dyes who provided empathy, cultural competence, and vital psychosocial support actually a massive mistake for maternal care?
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3 and our second pillar, water management and ancient irrigation. Across the semi-arid regions of India, there are thousands of earthen embankments called ahars in the north or eris in the south. These are incredibly ingenious, semicircular surface flow irrigation reservoirs. They're specifically designed to capture water escaping down sloping terrain after the monsoons. When colonial engineers first saw them, they dismissively labeled these structures as simple tanks, and honestly, that is a highly misleading term that completely masks their true engineering brilliance.
Because making this engineering work required an entire social system to function. Far from being simple mud puddles, maintaining these so-called tanks required incredible upkeep. We're talking about cleaning sluices, repairing breaches, strengthening embankments, and desilting. You couldn't just have one person do this. It was like a giant puzzle requiring highly coordinated community management. This concept of self-governing common property was actually so structurally impressive that decades later, studying similar systems earned researcher Elinor Ostrom a Nobel Prize in 2009.
And to really illustrate their immense scale, get this. Some of these so-called minor tanks are absolutely colossal. The ancient Kumbum tank in Andhra Pradesh features an embankment that is over 30 meters high. To put that in perspective, by strict modern international engineering standards, anything over 15 meters is classified as a large dam. Yet because we labeled them traditional tanks, modern irrigation departments just largely ignored them for decades. Let's move on to Section 4. Our third pillar is shelter, specifically focusing on vernacular housing and earthquake resistance.
Back in 1991, a completely devastating 6.6 magnitude earthquake hit Uttarkashi. When investigators, including the renowned architect Laurie Baker, went in to assess the damage, they were stunned. They found that many brand new, modern concrete houses had completely collapsed. The steel was broken, the concrete was shattered, and the materials were totally unsalvageable. Meanwhile, traditional vernacular houses built with local wood, mud, and slate just rode out the massive tremors completely unharmed. And hey, even if they were damaged, their materials could be easily salvaged and reused.
And this was for sure not a fluke. Up in the village of Koti Banal, researchers looked at intact 4- and 5-story traditional houses that had survived the quake. They did radiocarbon dating on the wooden panels, and they proved something absolutely incredible. This specific, highly effective earthquake-safe construction style had been perfected by indigenous builders a staggering 1,000 years ago. Modern engineering is literally just now catching up to what these traditional builders knew a millennium ago.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, our fourth pillar, land, and the Niyamgiri case for indigenous rights. The Niyamgiri Hills in Odisha are this profoundly biodiverse, sacred landscape. They are home to the Dongaria Khand, a vulnerable indigenous tribal group who rely entirely on this ecosystem for their medicines, their livelihood, and their spiritual life. But these hills also happen to be incredibly rich in bauxite. So, a multinational corporation named Vedanta sought to build a massive alumina refinery and mine right there. This obviously threatened the region with total ecological devastation and the complete displacement of the tribe.
What followed was a conflict that spanned over a decade. It started with mining agreements in the late 90s, but it eventually escalated into a massive global movement. I mean, protests in London were even drawing comparisons to the movie Avatar. Eventually, a government committee found massive environmental and human rights violations, and the clearance was halted in 2010. But the whole thing culminated in a historic, defining Supreme Court judgment in 2013. In this landmark decision, the Supreme Court legally affirmed that the state actually has a duty to recognize and support the identity of these communities. They made it clear, indigenous people aren't obstacles to development. Because of their traditional knowledge, they are actually the ultimate rightful custodians of environmental management. The court basically recognized that protecting the forest literally means protecting the rights of the very people who have sustainably managed it for centuries.
So, the court ordered that the decision to mine had to be placed directly before the local village assemblies, known as Gram Sabhas, enforcing the Forest Rights Act of 2006. This act is completely revolutionary. It grants equal rights to both tribal and non-tribal traditional dwellers, and it strictly requires prior informed consent for development. It literally gave these local assemblies absolute veto power over a massive multinational project. And so, in 2014, all 12 Gram Sabhas unanimously rejected the mine, successfully asserting a legally binding voice in their own survival. So, look at what we've covered today. From the life-saving psychosocial care of midwives to monumental 30-meter-high ancient irrigation dams to 1,000-year-old earthquake-proof homes, all the way to legal frameworks that empower indigenous environmental custodians. When you lay it all out, traditional knowledge is clearly not primitive. It is a highly sophisticated, incredibly vital science of survival.
We really have to stop equating the word traditional with obsolete. Traditional means time-tested. As we face these mounting, unprecedented global crises today, from climate change to severe healthcare shortages, we really have to ask ourselves, what other ancient, life-saving solutions are we completely ignoring right now, simply because we labeled them traditional? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this changes how you look at the wisdom of our past.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating: the staggering wealth of India's biodiversity and the intense, very modern battles over who actually owns it. We're going to unpack exactly how centuries of indigenous practices and natural wonders are intersecting and sometimes violently colliding with global intellectual property laws. Okay, let's dive into this. India is home to a staggering 46,000 recorded plant species. Now, what makes this so remarkable is that India covers just 2.4% of the world's land area, yet it's recognized globally as a mega biodiversity hotspot. It is quite literally teeming with life. And it doesn't stop at plants, folks. There are also 91,000 recorded animal species. But this isn't just about throwing biological statistics at you. This immense natural wealth actually forms the bedrock of ancient traditional knowledge. For thousands of years, local communities have deeply understood and utilized these resources. And today, that ancient expertise is highly coveted by modern, multi-billion-dollar global industries. Which brings us to the core tension of our explainer. What happens when ancient traditions collide head-on with modern patent law? When the heritage of a local community comes face-to-face with the intellectual property ambitions of a massive multinational corporation, who wins? Who loses? And how on earth do we navigate the ethics of the whole shebang? Let's move to and see how this builds across the 4 distinct case studies we're going to examine today: the wonder herb of the Kakani tribe, the revitalization of local health traditions, the global battle for basmati rice, and traditional knowledge in cosmetics. But first, let's just anchor ourselves in the core vocabulary.
When we talk about genetic resources, we mean any material from plants, animals, or microbes that contains functional units of heredity of actual or potential value. Think of this highly valuable umbrella as including everything from unique crop varieties and medicinal plants to native animal breeds. These are the raw materials sitting right at the center of our global biodiversity battles.
All right, let's jump into case study number 1, the wonder herb of Quinus and the struggle for ethical benefit sharing.
So, the story starts back in 1987. A team of scientists was out on a grueling expedition in the Agastyaar Hills, and frankly, they were completely exhausted. But they noticed their guides, members of the local Kani tribe, were totally energetic and untired. The guides were casually munching on this sacred black fruit they called Arogia pacha, which translates to green health. They offered some to the exhausted scientists, and they were instantly rejuvenated. Almost like magic, right? Thanks to their Kani guides, modern science had just stumbled upon an incredibly powerful anti-fatigue herb.
And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. Following the discovery, scientists at the Tropical Botanic Garden Research Institute, the TBGRI, isolated the properties and actually formulated a drug called Jivani. But here's the kicker. They didn't just take the knowledge and run. In a move that was virtually unheard of in the 1990s, they set up a voluntary pioneering trust to share 50% of their scientific royalties directly with the Kani tribe. It was this truly groundbreaking attempt at ethical benefit sharing in modern science. However, tragedy struck, mostly in the form of heavy bureaucracy. Because Arogia pacha wasn't officially listed as a minor forest produce, forest officials classified it as illegal to transport out of the woods. This super strict enforcement inadvertently killed the legitimate supply chain entirely. The project just starved. And to make matters worse, while this was happening in India, a US-based company stepped in and legally trademarked the Jivani name in America. Meanwhile, the coveted plant was pushed entirely into the black market back home. It's a tragic irony, really. A pioneering ethical agreement completely derailed by a lack of coordinated policy.
Moving on to case study 2, revitalizing local health traditions and holistic conservation.
Here, the Foundation for Revitalization of Local Health Traditions, or FRLHT, moved way beyond just filing defensive patents. They built an actionable framework based on 3 clear steps: conserving natural resources, revitalizing the social transmission of this medical heritage, and ensuring high-quality practices. So instead of just patenting a single plant and calling it a day, they helped establish 110 medicinal plant conservation areas across India. And incredibly, they facilitated the creation of hundreds of thousands of home herbal gardens. It was all about keeping the knowledge actively alive in the hands of everyday people.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it reveals a profound epistemological difference. Think about it. When modern science looks to validate traditional medicine, it's usually hunting for active chemical extracts, like, say, prescribing an iron tablet for anemia. But traditional holistic approaches, like Ayurveda, they validate through empirical life experiences, focusing on the whole body system. So rather than just giving iron, they might use a plant that improves the body's natural iron metabolism. Recognizing that both of these systems have valid yet fundamentally different ways of understanding health is absolutely crucial if we want to protect traditional knowledge without erasing its actual meaning.
Let's look at case study 3, the global battle for basmati and defending the aroma. Back in 1997, a Texas-based company called RiceTech filed a U.S. patent. They were claiming to have invented quote-unquote novel rice lines that produced grains similar to good-quality basmati rice. They essentially took knowledge, the unique aroma, the specific grain length, the traditional growing methods that have been developed by local Indian farmers over generations, and they attempted to claim it as a novel, patentable invention in the United States. No way, right? Well, this sparked an epic years-long legal timeline. Following that initial 1997 U.S. patent, the Indian government officially mounted a massive legal challenge in the year 2000. They presented hard evidence that these grain characteristics were not novel at all, but already existed in traditional varieties. Realizing they needed a much stronger defensive shield going forward, India enacted the Geographical Indications, or GI Act, in 2003. And finally, after years of grueling domestic and international legal wrangling, traditional growing regions were officially granted GI certification in 2016. But unfortunately, the battle isn't entirely over, and it comes down to international legal mechanics. See, under the World Trade Organization, products like French champagne enjoy what's called Article 23 protection, which mandates very strict prevention of any global misuse. Basmati rice, however, currently only falls under Article 22, which offers a much more general, lower tier of protection.
Because of this, India is forced to spend millions of dollars annually just to constantly monitor global trademark registers and fight off international misappropriations of the Basmati name. And that brings us to our fourth and final case study, traditional knowledge in cosmetics, commercialization, and ethical biotrade. So the crucial point is the sheer scale of the economics involved here. It is massive. By 2016, the domestic market size for Ayurvedic personal care in India alone had hit 5 billion rupees. Pioneers like Shahnaz Hussain proved decades ago that the knowledge of a 5,000-year-old civilization could be beautifully and highly successfully commercialized. They essentially shifted consumers away from harsh chemicals and steered them towards traditional natural ingredients.
But as this market explodes on a global scale, we're seeing a really sharp divide in how corporations operate. On one hand, you have cases of unethical exploitation. For example, the cosmetics brand Aveda was actually sued by Native Americans for lacking any sort of benefit-sharing agreement over their traditional plant knowledge. But on the flip side, we have incredible models of ethical biotrade. Take the French company Aldivia. They developed a process for pure marula oil, and they legally co-owned the patent with the primary African producers. It proves that ethical, co-owned patents aren't just a nice idea. They're a highly viable, modern solution.
So, how does a country protect its heritage while still keeping it accessible to the world? Well, India's answer is the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, or TKDL. Think of it as a massive, curated defensive database. By formally documenting knowledge from systems like Ayurveda, India ensures that this public domain knowledge remains free for anyone to use, while simultaneously serving as an ironclad legal shield. It blocks unscrupulous foreign actors from swooping in and patenting ancient remedies as new inventions. It defends the public while making sure specific tribal knowledge is protected for direct benefit sharing. Which leaves us with this final, lingering question to wrap up on. Who actually gets the compensation for our traditional knowledge? When a centuries-old remedy is beautifully packaged in a sleek little jar and sold on a shelf across the globe, who is really cashing the check? The scientists, the giant corporations, or the indigenous communities who nurtured and preserved this wisdom for generations? It's arguably the ultimate ethical dilemma of the modern age. And it's definitely something to think deeply about the next time you pick up a natural product. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.
Welcome to this explainer. You know, if you think about the herbal supplements sitting in your bathroom cabinet, or maybe those wooden toys your kids play with, it's really easy to just dismiss those ancient traditions as quaint folklore. We tend to view them as lovely, historical stories that belong in a museum, right? But what if I told you that they are actually massive, untapped, multi-billion-dollar industrial assets? We are going to look closely at how the ancient R&D of our ancestors is quite literally hiding in plain sight, just waiting to be properly unlocked.
Okay, let's kick things off with a totally staggering number. $70 billion. That is the estimated size of the global herbal medicine market today. Just let that sink in for a second. That is a colossal amount of capital flowing into products that are rooted directly in traditional knowledge. We're not talking about a niche, local market here. It's an absolute behemoth of a global industry.
But here's where things get really interesting. Take a country like India. It is an absolute powerhouse of ancient medicinal knowledge. You would naturally think they'd be dominating this space, right? Yet, their share of that colossal $70 billion market is a meager 0.5%. That is a microscopic slice of the pie for a culture with thousands of years of documented herbal expertise. And this glaring gap brings us to a very important multi-billion-dollar question. Why exactly is this traditional knowledge failing to cash in on modern global markets? And, more importantly, how can we successfully package and monetize it without losing its original essence? To figure that out, we're going to quickly explore 5 key areas: pharma's traditional roots, sweet innovation in Bengal, patenting the sacred ring, the Chanapatna toy revival, and finally, unlocking traditional knowledge. Starting off with Section 1, Pharma's traditional roots, the billion-dollar cure. Let's look at how traditional texts can literally cure modern plagues, but only if they undergo rigorous modern validation. This is honestly the ultimate medical detective story. Back in the 1960s, drug-resistant malaria was a massive global crisis. So, in China, a confidential military project called Project 523 was launched to find a cure. In 1969, a researcher named Yu Tu joined the team. She scoured traditional Chinese medical literature and found recipes using a specific herb. But her early tests were really inconsistent.
That is, until she found a vital clue in a 1700-year-old text. It suggested avoiding heat during extraction. Once she redesigned her process to extract it cold, boom, she discovered artemisinin. By 1972, clinical trials were a resounding success. She unlocked a cure that saved millions of lives, secured partnerships with global pharma giants, and eventually won a Nobel Prize in 2015.
Now, you've got to contrast that methodical, rigorous success with other, let's say, less careful attempts. Take India's approach to an Ayurvedic diabetes drug called BGR34. It was launched recently by a premier research institute, and they claimed really high success rates. But researchers quickly pointed out a complete lack of transparent, registered clinical trials. Rushed claims with obscure scientific validation don't just fail in the market, they end up actively discrediting a globally renowned pool of traditional expertise. The big takeaway here? Modern science doesn't replace traditional knowledge, it validates it for the world stage.
All right, let's jump into Section 2, Sweet Innovation in Bengal, the village industry.
So, science validates tradition, right? But as we look at the village industries of Bengal, we'll see that modern technology also has to step in to preserve it. We're talking about a food delicacy called Khejur Gur. It's this highly aromatic date palm jaggery that is absolutely beloved in Bengal. The ancient Bengalis perfected a centuries-old process for making it. Traditional artisans called shulis have this meticulous skill to tap the wild date palm tree without killing it, which is crucial because these trees can produce sap for up to 50 years. But because the sap ferments almost immediately as the temperature rises, it requires rapid boiling right near the trees with incredibly exacting temperature control. It's an intensely delicate balance. But despite its legendary taste, this traditional industry was facing a severe modern crisis. First off, the trees were being seen as expendable, getting chopped down by local brick kilns for cheap fuel. Second, with high demand and dropping supply, unscrupulous traders started selling fake, chemically flavored adulterated gur, which completely threatened consumer trust. And on top of all that, younger generations were abandoning these highly skilled but really poorly paid tapping jobs. The tradition was literally dying out.
But look at what happened when modern technology intervened. The savior here wasn't trying to change the ancient recipe. Instead, the Indian Institute of Packaging brought in state-of-the-art tube packaging. Traditionally, this gur spoiled super fast in open clay pots. By putting the premium Nalan gur into a sealed, test tube-like package, they dramatically increased its shelf life. Suddenly, this highly perishable local delicacy became incredibly easy to transport. It opened up vast new domestic and export markets, pouring much-needed revenue right back into the pockets of the artisans.
Moving right along to Section 3, patenting the sacred ring, gems, and jewelry. Let's see how all this builds when we introduce legal frameworks. Because as traditional items enter these lucrative global markets, we run into some absolutely fascinating legal hurdles. This brings us to the complex world of the Payanur Pavithram ring in Kerala. To understand this turf war, we first need to quickly define a geographical indicator, or GI tag. Unlike a standard trademark that's owned by one single company or individual, a GI tag is specifically designed to protect the community ownership of region-specific products. It basically says, hey, this unique product belongs entirely to the artisans of this specific region. And that brings us to the ring itself. The Payanur Pavithram ring is a uniquely crafted piece of gold jewelry. It actually originated as a substitute for the traditional sacred durba grass used in Hindu rituals. It is absolutely packed with intricate religious cosmology. The curvy structural lines in the design literally represent the three main nerves in the human body, the Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. And because of its exquisite craftsmanship and deep spiritual symbolism, the price of a single ring can easily reach 1 lakh rupees. It's highly lucrative.
Of course, where there is money, there are intellectual property wars. The battle lines were drawn. Should a single private jewelry company get to own this religious symbol and all its profits via trademark simply by claiming historical lineage? Or should the entire community of regional artisans share those rights through a GI tag? Ultimately, the Intellectual Property Appellate Board stepped in to ensure that all the genuine artisans in the cluster had a voice. They correctly recognized that traditional knowledge like this is a common right given to a society, absolutely not a private monopoly.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Channapatna Toy Revival, Handicrafts.
Pivoting from high-stakes legal battles in jewelry to our final case study, let's look at how ancient traditions literally stepped in to save us from a modern, toxic disaster. It asks a vital question. What exactly happens when the cheap, modern mass manufacturing that the entire world relies on turns out to be dangerously toxic to our kids?
Well, in the summer of 2007, the world found out the hard way. Millions of mass-produced lead-contaminated Chinese toys were suddenly recalled across the US. It was a massive global health scare. Parents were panicking, and the market desperately needed a safe alternative. Enter India's Chanapatna toys. These are traditional, handmade wooden toys colored strictly with natural vegetable dyes. They were eco-friendly, completely safe, and honestly, the perfect ancient solution to a very modern crisis. But the absolute turning point for these artisans came in 2010. And it's pretty wild how an ancient Indian craft was catapulted onto the world stage by a simple shopping trip. U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama visited India and went on a highly publicized shopping spree, specifically buying these safe, traditional Chanapatna toys for her kids and friends. Her endorsement made worldwide news, and it created an unprecedented, massive surge in global demand literally overnight. But catching lightning in a bottle is one thing. Keeping it is another. The artisans couldn't just rely on centuries-old charm to export globally. They had to aggressively adapt to modern trade. To crack foreign markets, new generations of toy makers acquired rigorous international safety standard certificates, like the ASTM F963. They set up distribution channels on modern e-commerce platforms like Craftsvilla to reach global buyers directly. And they secured World Fair Trade Organization marks to leverage ethical marketing. They successfully married ancient craftsmanship with modern business compliance.
And finally, Section 5, Unlocking Traditional Knowledge.
All right, let's pull all of these amazing stories together. What do these four wildly different industries teach us about the future? Just look at the patterns here. Whether it's the Artemisinin in herbs and medicine desperately needing FDA trials, the Kajor gur in food needing modern tube packaging to survive spoilage, the sacred gold ring relying on community GI tags to settle ownership disputes, or those wooden toys requiring international safety certs for market access. The underlying truth is staring us in the face. Traditional knowledge is an undeniably powerful asset, but it absolutely cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires modern validation, technology, legal frameworks, and certifications to actually succeed and scale on the global stage. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Are we going to keep dismissing these ancient practices as a quaint folklore, essentially leaving billions of dollars of our heritage sitting on the table? Or are we finally ready to package, protect, and unleash the ancient R&D of our ancestors onto the modern world? The choice is entirely ours, and the potential is literally limitless. Thanks so much for joining me on This Explainer, and keep questioning what you think you know.
Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into the massive, often hidden intellectual property battles happening right behind the scenes of our modern culture. We are going to explore what exactly happens when ancient living traditions collide head-on with modern legal systems. Seriously, who truly gets to claim ownership over the art, the sounds, and the practices that have defined human history for centuries? It's wild stuff.
Think about this for a second. Can you literally copyright a stretch? Or, I don't know, legally own a 500-year-old song? It sounds completely absurd, right? But these are very real, incredibly high-stakes questions being fought over in courtrooms around the world right now. When we take modern IP laws and apply them to ancient collective heritage, well, it fundamentally challenges how we even define ownership. Okay, let's dive into this. First, we'll define what are cultural expressions. Then we'll look at the Banarasi-Saudi battle, stealing India's folk music, decolonizing built heritage, who owns modern yoga, and finally, protecting our collective heritage.
Chapter 1. What are cultural expressions? Living, evolving practices, not ancient relics.
So what is at the center of this legal tug-of-war? It's something called Traditional Cultural Expressions, or TCEs. These are dynamic forms created within traditional cultures. But the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that they are not just dusty, inert relics sitting in a museum. What makes this knowledge traditional isn't just how old it is, it's the vital, dynamic link to living, breathing communities today. They are constantly evolving.
To grasp the massive scope of what we're talking about today, we can categorize TCEs into four main pillars. You've got materials, like handicrafts, architecture, and textiles. Then there are actions, things like dance, rituals, yoga, and folk music. You also have verbal expressions, think epic stories, legends, and symbols. And finally, written literature and cultural adaptations. Basically, this covers almost every single way a culture expresses its identity. It's the whole shebang.
Chapter 2. The Banarasi-Saudi Battle, the struggle against cheap imitations.
30 to 40%. That is a staggering number. It represents the sharp decline in the annual income of traditional Banarasi weavers over just a 10-year period after the multi-fiber agreement expired. When global markets opened up, these traditional artisans suddenly found themselves facing severe economic hardship. We're talking about a reality where some of these master weavers are facing crushing debt and even malnutrition.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in production. On one side, you have the genuine article, woven on hand looms by traditional artisans using pure Bangalore silk, natural dyes, and ancient geometric patterns. It's painstaking work. On the other side, the market was absolutely flooded by mass-produced imitations churned out on Gujarati power looms, utilizing cheap, imported Chinese silk and computer-generated copies of those original designs. The authentic creators literally couldn't compete on price.
To fight back against this, a Geographical Indication, or GI tag, was awarded in 2009 to protect Benares brocades and saris. This acts as a legal shield, meaning only true local producers can legally use the name. But here's the tragic flaw. There was very little effort put into educating the weavers themselves. That means many local artisans today have absolutely no idea they even need to register to become authorized users of their very own heritage.
Chapter 3. Stealing India's Folk Music, Exploitation by the Recording Industry.
Moving from physical textiles to the intangible world of sound. For centuries, music lived only in the moment. But in 1903, the gramophone changed everything. By the time the 1957 Copyright Act passed in India, the laws heavily favored producers over the artists. This technological advancement led to decades where traditional songs were utilized commercially without compensating the original performers. It wasn't until a major legal pushback in 2012 that an amendment finally mandated that royalties must be shared with the actual artists.
Let's look at a specific, pretty emotional example from 1999 involving the folk song Nimbuda. It became a massive, highly profitable Bollywood superhit. However, it was originally composed by a folk singer named Ghazni Khan Monganyar. The film's music director basically stole the song and used it without giving any credit. Because of how the copyright was filed by the big studio, the original creator, Ghazni Khan, actually feared he would be legally required to pay royalties to the film studio just to sing his own song back in his village.
To truly understand the frustration of these artists watching their heritage get legally stolen, consider this powerful quote from Rajasthani folk singer Rajnigandha Shekhawat. She says, "The concept of picking up a folk song, using it in a film with minor changes, and claiming composer credit and copyright is exactly like a foreigner registering copyright for discovering medicinal properties of neem. It perfectly hits the nail on the head regarding the friction between traditional knowledge and modern Einmüller."
Chapter 4. Decolonizing Built Heritage, Shifting from Colonial Conservation to Community Preservation.
And this brilliantly illustrates how even physical buildings have been subject to ideological battles. We see two fundamentally different approaches here. First is colonial conservation, spearheaded by figures like Lord Curzon. They preserved structures, sure, but often modified them to fit Western aesthetics, like literally hanging a Cairo-style lamp inside the Taj Mahal, just completely culturally tone-deaf. Conversely, modern indigenous preservation empowers local communities. They use traditional master builders to maintain these sites not as static museum pieces, but as living, breathing heritage.
Chapter 5. Who owns modern yoga? The clash of ancient practice and modern patents. Next time you head to your local gym or roll out a mat in your living room, think about this number, $27 billion. Take a second to just process that. That's the estimated financial scale of the yoga industry in the United States alone, fueled by over 24 million regular practitioners. With that massive level of commercialization, it was really only a matter of time before someone attempted to lock down legal ownership of these ancient physical movements.
This brings us to the absolute audacity of the Bikram Yoga copyright case. The strategy here was straightforward. Bikram Choudhury wrote a book detailing a specific sequence of 26 ancient yoga poses. He then filed for copyright protection on that sequence and actually began suing competing yoga studios, claiming they were infringing on his intellectual property. Can you believe that? Well, ultimately, the courts shut it down. The judge ruled that ideas and traditional physical poses cannot be copyrighted, effectively preventing a monopoly on the practice.
Chapter 6. Protecting Our Collective Heritage. Where do we go from here?
So the crucial point is that this is all a very delicate balancing act. Unchecked intellectual property laws leave traditional artisans and folk artists incredibly vulnerable to commercial exploitation, as we've seen.
But on the flip side, overly restrictive cultural copyrights could completely stifle creativity and prevent cultures from naturally sharing and evolving. Experts suggest the solution lies in ethical sampling, clear public acknowledgement, and equitable benefit sharing. The focus has to be on protecting the community, not just corporate producers.
I'll leave you with this provocative thought. When we look at the deeply personal struggles of Banarasi weavers, folk musicians, and traditional builders, our Western intellectual property laws, frameworks originally designed for mass-produced goods and corporate entities, truly equipped to govern the world's ancient collective soul? It's a massive question, and how we answer it is going to shape the future of our shared human heritage. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really hope it leaves you curious to explore more about the open source history of our world.
Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a topic I've honestly always been super curious about, the intersection of ancient knowledge and modern science. Now, if you spend any amount of time online, you've probably seen some pretty wild claims out there about ancient civilizations literally inventing modern tech, right? It happens all the time. But today, we're going to cut through the noise. We're looking at the actual, verified research together. And what we find is, well, it's actually even more fascinating than the myths. We'll see how researchers are legitimately using ancient frameworks to solve some of the 21st century's absolute biggest challenges, finding this incredible underlying theme of resilience that bridges everything from artificial intelligence all the way to global climate change.
Okay, let's do a quick run-through of our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with ancient wisdom, modern science, tackle the whole Sanskrit NASA myth, look at the rules of generative grammar, and then we'll shift gears into climate adaptation, coastal resilience, before wrapping it all up with fact versus fiction.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science.
To kick things off, we kind of have to address the literal elephant in the room. We've all seen the viral posts, the forwarded family messages, but we've got to ask, does NASA really use Sanskrit to program AI?
Well, the reality here is actually way cooler than the myth. NASA never made Sanskrit an official policy. Instead, back in 1985, a NASA researcher named Rick Briggs published a really brilliant independent paper. He hypothesized that because Sanskrit is just so highly structured, it could potentially be incredibly useful for artificial intelligence. So the internet kind of twisted this into a huge conspiracy, but the actual linguistic research it sparked, that is completely legitimate.
Moving on to Section 3, Rules of Generative Grammar.
So human natural language is messy. It just is. Think of Isaac Asimov's classic sci-fi story, Little Lost Robot. A frustrated scientist tells a robot to get lost, and lacking any human context, the robot literally goes and hides itself. Early AI researchers really struggled with this ambiguity. Machines only understand strict algebraic rules, ones and zeros. They don't do nuance. To fix this, researchers realized they needed a natural language that actually behaved like machine code.
Eventually, computer scientists realized that trying to build exhaustive, rule-based systems for every single possible scenario was just way too expensive and complex. So they shifted to a concept known as case-based reasoning, or CBR. Basically, this allows an AI to look at a vast database of old problems in order to solve a new, similar one. And what's absolutely fascinating is that researchers found the ancient Indian logic system of Navya-Nyaya, which was created centuries ago to eliminate ambiguity in philosophy, actually serves as a perfect ancient blueprint for this very modern machine learning technique.
To understand how this works in reality, imagine trying to teach a robot to cook a recipe or fix a car. The instructions have to be completely flawless. Researchers have recently been using ancient philosophical frameworks, specifically the Mimamsa school of philosophy, to computationally sort human commands into concrete categories. We're talking things like negative injunctions, mandatory instructions, or optional ones. By looking to the past, scientists basically found a much more exhaustive framework to build the architecture for modern robotics. It really just goes to show how ancient logic can directly improve the tech we rely on today.
Okay, let's pivot to Section 4. Shifting to climate adaptation.
Now let's see how this underlying theme of ancient resilience applies to a totally different field. For the longest time, the global community was completely fixated on just trying to stop emissions. In fact, back in 1992, adaptation was actually looked down upon. But developing nations, who contributed the least to the problem but were suffering the absolute most, pushed back hard. Tracking the timeline to 2002 at COP8 in New Delhi, the conversation shifts forcefully, demanding that adaptation be prioritized. And that argument won. By the time of the 2015 Paris Agreement, adaptation was given parallel importance to mitigation, and traditional knowledge was officially recognized as a vital guide for these climate actions.
So why was this shift so absolutely critical? Well, it comes down to the sheer reality on the ground.
According to the Indian government's first report to the UNFCCC back in 2004, the country was facing literal existential threats. We're looking at decreased snow cover in the Himalayas, erratic monsoons completely threatening food security, rising sea levels risking mass displacement along the entire coast, plus a terrifying increase in the frequency of floods. For a nation dealing with these vulnerabilities, you can't just talk about reducing future emissions decades from now. You need immediate ground-level adaptation just to survive today.
Which brings us to Section 5, Seeds of Coastal Resilience. On December 26, 2004, the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami struck. Tragically, thousands upon thousands lost their lives. But amidst all that destruction, the Indian Ministry of Home Affairs reported a truly staggering statistic. 5 out of the 6 indigenous tribes in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were safe. How is that possible? Well, they didn't have modern satellite warning systems. Instead, they used ancient bioindicators. They observed the unusual movements of animals, shifts in plants, and changes in marine life to actually predict the disaster and move to higher ground before it hit. This is a purely pragmatic, observational science that proves the immediate life-saving power of indigenous knowledge.
And you know, the survival of that knowledge proved just as crucial during the recovery phase. Following the tsunami in the Nagapattinam district, coastal farmlands were heavily flooded with seawater. This left massive salt deposits that practically destroyed the soil. Modern, high-yielding varieties of rice, they completely failed in these conditions. But organizations like the Center for Indian Knowledge Systems stepped in. They tested the soil and reintroduced a traditional, highly salt-tolerant rice variety called Kujua Vidichan, and it thrived right where modern seeds died. To protect this vital genetic diversity, a rigorous in situ conservation process was established. They meticulously grow these indigenous varieties yearly across different regions, ensuring disaster-resilient seeds are never lost. And this matters to all of us, because protecting this biodiversity is basically our global insurance policy for future food security.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, Fact versus Fiction.
We absolutely have to strictly separate the legitimate, scientifically sound applications of ancient knowledge from dangerous pseudoscience. For example, at the 103rd Indian Science Congress in 2016, amidst amazing presentations on indigenous livestock and water mitigation, an invited speaker made headlines by claiming that blowing a conch shell could eliminate key human disorders. The media, understandably, tore it apart. And this is the real tragedy here. Just a few highly publicized, unscientific aberrations draw all the negative attention. It actively discredits the hardworking computational linguists mapping grammar to AI and the molecular biologists quietly conserving climate-resilient seeds.
So, what have we discovered today? Ancient traditional knowledge isn't just some dusty relic of the past. It's a vital, living tool for our future. It literally stretches from the architecture of artificial intelligence to the very seeds that are going to survive a changing climate. But I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. How do we continue to harness the incredible resilience of ancient wisdom for our modern world while maintaining strict, rigorous scientific standards to keep out the pseudoscience? It's a tricky balance we absolutely must strike. Thanks so much for exploring this with me.